Brian Shaffer's disappearance remains one of the most baffling and chilling unsolved mysteries in modern true crime. On the surface, he was a 27-year-old medical student living a promising life. Shaffer was attending Ohio State University's College of Medicine, working hard toward his future. He was known as a friendly, easygoing guy who loved music, especially tropical tunes by artists like Jimmy Buffett, and dreamt of starting a band one day. His life, however, was not without struggles. In March 2006, just weeks before his disappearance, his mother had passed away after battling myelodysplasia. While Brian appeared to be coping, those close to him knew the loss had hit him hard. Brian's disappearance occurred after what seemed like a typical night out. On March 31st, 2006, with spring break just beginning, Brian and his friend Clint Florence decided to celebrate the occasion by going out for drinks in Columbus, Ohio. Their night began at a bar called the Ugly Tuna Saloon, and they spent the night hopping from bar to bar in the city's arena district. That night would become infamous, not for anything dramatic or chaotic, but because Brian vanished without a trace. Despite extensive searches, ongoing investigations, and countless theories, what happened to Brian Shaffer remains a mystery to this day. The night began uneventfully enough. After having dinner with his father earlier in the evening, Brian met up with Clint Florence around 9 at night at the Ugly Tuna Saloon, a popular bar in the South Campus Gateway complex. At around 10 at night, Brian called his girlfriend, Alexis Wagoner, who was visiting her family in Toledo. Alexis, who Brian was planning to go on vacation with to Miami later that week, didn't notice anything unusual in his voice. They chatted briefly, with Brian promising he would see her soon. Brian and Clint continued bar hopping through the night, stopping at several other drinking establishments along the way. Around midnight, they met up with Clint's friend Meredith Reed, who offered them a ride back to the Ugly Tuna Saloon for one last round. The group was seen entering the bar around 1:15 in the morning, caught on security cameras. Brian was last seen on camera around 1:55 in the morning, just outside the bar, talking briefly with two women. After a short conversation, he said goodbye to them and moved out of the camera's view. When the bar closed at 2 in the morning, Clint and Meredith waited outside for Brian, assuming he would soon join them. But Brian never came out. Thinking he had perhaps gone home on his own, they left. No one realized at the time that this would be the last time Brian Shaffer would ever be seen. When Brian failed to show up for his flight to Miami on April 3rd, his family and girlfriend grew increasingly concerned. He wasn't answering calls or texts, and his father soon reported him missing. The Columbus police launched a thorough investigation, starting at the Ugly Tuna Saloon, where Brian had last been seen. Security footage confirmed he had entered the bar, but curiously, there was no footage of him leaving. The bar's only public entrance and exit were covered by cameras, yet none captured Brian exiting. Investigators were puzzled. The Ugly Tuna Saloon had another exit, a service door that led to a construction site, but it was considered dangerous and unlikely that Brian would have used it, especially after drinking that night. Additionally, surveillance cameras outside of nearby bars didn't show any signs of him either. It was as if he had disappeared into thin air. The police combed the area surrounding the bar, checked dumpsters, and even searched the city's sewer system, but found no trace of Brian. His car was still parked at his apartment, and there was no evidence suggesting he had returned home after that night. Flyers were posted throughout Columbus, and tips began pouring in, though none led to any significant breakthroughs. Investigators also interviewed Brian's friends, including Clint Florence, who had been with him that night. All of them, except Clint, agreed to take polygraph tests, which they passed. Clint's refusal to take a polygraph test raised suspicion, but no direct evidence has ever linked him to Brian's disappearance. As the investigation continued, theories about what might have happened to Brian began to surface. One theory suggested he had chosen to disappear voluntarily. Perhaps investigators speculated Brian was overwhelmed by the recent loss of his mother and decided to start a new life elsewhere. However, his family and friends found it difficult to believe he would leave without telling anyone, especially since he had plans to go on vacation with his girlfriend just days later. Other theories were far more sinister. The area around the ugly Tuna Saloona was known for its high crime rate, and some suspected Brian may have been a victim of foul play. Investigators also briefly considered the possibility that Brian could have fallen prey to the smiley face killer, a theory that suggests a group of killers is responsible for drowning young men across the Midwest. However, no evidence has surfaced to support this theory in Brian's case. Despite the numerous searches and hundreds of tips that were called in, no solid clues emerged. A psychic even claimed that Brian's body was in a body of water near a bridge, prompting his father and brother to search local rivers and lakes to no avail. The case remained unsolved, and as the years passed, hope of finding Brian alive began to fade. The disappearance of Brian Shaffer remains one of the most mysterious and haunting cold cases in recent memory. With no physical evidence, no confirmed sightings, and no explanation for how he left the bar that night, the case has baffled investigators, his family, and internet sleuths alike. Brian's father, Randy Shaffer, dedicated himself to finding his son until his own tragic death in 2008. Even after his passing, the search for Brian continued, but each lead proved fruitless. One particularly eerie moment occurred in 2006 when Brian's girlfriend, Alexis, continued calling his phone long after he disappeared. In September, several months after the disappearance, the phone rang 3 times before going to voicemail. Though this gave a glimmer of hope, it was later determined to be a glitch, and the phone pinged a cell tower in a location far from where Brian had last been seen. Theories continue to circulate about what happened to Brian Shaffer that night in 2006. Some believe he may have met with foul play, while others think he staged his disappearance and is living under a new identity somewhere. To this day, the case remains unsolved, leaving his loved ones without answers, and the public captivated by the enduring mystery. Brian Shaffer's story is a reminder of how quickly life can change, and how some mysteries refuse to be solved, despite all efforts to uncover the truth. The Cleveland Torso Murders is one of the most chilling and perplexing cases in American history. The story begins in the 1930s, a time when Cleveland, Ohio was struggling to recover from the Great Depression. Amidst the economic hardship, a series of gruesome murders shocked the city, and the horrors of these crimes left the residents living in fear. The victims were usually drifters and people from marginalized communities, making it difficult for authorities to identify them. Over 4 years, at least 12 people were brutally murdered and dismembered by an unknown killer. The remains of the victims were scattered throughout the area, often in the impoverished neighborhood of Kingsbury Run, known for its shanty towns and desperate conditions. This unidentified killer became infamously known as the Cleveland Torso Murderer, or the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run. The nature of the crimes was particularly horrifying. The killer would behead and dismember the victims, often while they were still alive. In some cases, the bodies were chemically treated, causing the skin to take on a red, leathery appearance. The decapitated heads were rarely found, adding to the difficulty of identifying the victims. The brutality and precision of the murders suggested that the killer had some medical knowledge, which only heightened the fear and mystery surrounding the case. As the murders continued, the citizens of Cleveland grew increasingly terrified. The police were under immense pressure to catch the killer, but despite their efforts, the case proved to be incredibly challenging. The lack of forensic technology at the time made it difficult to gather evidence, and the transient nature of the victims further complicated the investigation. The killer seemed to target those who were easy prey during the difficult times of the Great Depression, people who were often overlooked by society. The murders not only took lives, but also shattered the sense of safety and security in the city. The Cleveland Torso murders would go on to become the largest police investigation in Cleveland's history. The involvement of Elliot Ness, a famed lawman who had gained national attention for his work against organized crime, brought even more attention to the case. Despite the extensive efforts, the case remained unsolved, and the killer was never brought to justice. The gruesome nature of the crimes and the mystery surrounding the identity of the murderer have left a lasting scar on the city of Cleveland and continue to fascinate and terrify those who study the case. The Cleveland Torso murders remain one of the most haunting, unsolved mysteries in American crime history. As the city of Cleveland reeled from the initial shock of the grisly discovery, investigators began to piece together the chilling details of what would come to be known as the Cleveland Torso murders. The first body, found in a vacant lot in 1935, was just the beginning of a string of horrifying discoveries that would stretch over several years. The murder scenes were stark and unsettling. The dismembered bodies were typically found in or near abandoned lots, forests, and along the riverbanks of the Cuyahoga River. These locations, isolated and overlooked, became the grim backdrop for the killer's macabre handiwork. The victims were almost always identified as transients or individuals from the lower socioeconomic classes, further complicating the case. As the bodies continued to surface, a pattern began to emerge. Each victim was brutally dismembered, and their remains were carefully disposed of in a manner that suggested a calculated effort to avoid detection. The killer seemed to have an intimate knowledge of the city's geography, utilizing its hidden corners and forgotten spaces to his advantage. Investigators faced numerous challenges. The lack of advanced forensic technology meant that identifying the victims and tracing the killer's steps was a slow and arduous process. The mutilation of the bodies made it difficult to establish a clear profile of the killer or to determine any connections between the victims. One of the most perplexing aspects of the case was the apparent randomness of the murders. The killer did not seem to have a particular motive or pattern in selecting his victims, which made it even more challenging for law enforcement to anticipate his next move. The police were also hindered by a lack of cooperation from the public, who were terrified and reluctant to provide information. As the investigation dragged on, the media began to pick up on the story, sensationalizing the gruesome details and adding to the public's growing fear. The nickname Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run was coined, reflecting both the horrific nature of the crimes and the growing frustration of the authorities. The city was gripped by a sense of unease, with many residents avoiding the areas where the bodies had been discovered. Despite the extensive efforts of law enforcement, the Cleveland Torso murders remained unsolved, with each new discovery only adding to the chilling mystery of the case. The killer's identity and motives remained elusive, casting a long shadow over the city and leaving a legacy of fear and intrigue that would endure for decades. As the Cleveland Torso murders continued to baffle investigators, the city saw an intensification of efforts to track down the killer. The Cleveland Police Department, with limited resources and no modern forensic tools, faced mounting pressure to solve the case. They enlisted the help of various experts, including detectives from other cities and even federal agents, in a desperate bid to crack the case. One of the key figures in the investigation was Detective Joe Cermak. His thorough and methodical approach to the case earned him respect among his peers. Cermak and his team painstakingly examined every lead, conducted numerous interviews, and followed up on every piece of evidence, no matter how minor it seemed. Despite these efforts, the investigation was plagued by numerous setbacks. Many of the witnesses who might have had useful information were reluctant to come forward, often due to fear or mistrust of the police. The transient nature of many of the victims made it even harder to piece together their lives or find anyone who might have known them. The investigation focused on a number of potential suspects, but none were conclusively linked to the crimes. The most prominent suspect was a man named Frank Dolezal, a former Cleveland resident who had been committed to a mental institution. Dolezal was a known troublemaker with a violent history, and his behavior led some to believe he might be connected to the murders. However, a thorough investigation and lack of concrete evidence led to his eventual exclusion from the list of suspects. Another suspect was a man named Dr. Francis Sweeney, a local physician who was rumored to have a troubled past. Sweeney had been involved in several incidents that suggested he might be capable of such violence, but his alibis and lack of direct evidence kept him from being formally charged. Despite the suspicion surrounding him, Sweeney's involvement in the murders remained unproven. In the absence of clear leads, the police also examined the possibility that the killer might be someone with a deep-seated grudge against society or a personal vendetta. The brutality and methodical nature of the murders suggested a calculated and remorseless individual, but the lack of a clear motive only deepened the mystery. Public interest in the case remained high, with the media frequently reporting on the latest developments and fueling speculation. The gruesome details of the murders were often front-page news, contributing to a climate of fear and anxiety among the city's residents. The media's sensational coverage also created a phenomenon where numerous amateur sleuths and self-styled detectives attempted to solve the case, often with little success. As time went on, the Cleveland torso murders became a chilling reminder of the limits of early 20th century forensic science and the complexities of criminal investigations. Despite the dedication of those involved, the case remained unsolved, with the killer continuing to elude capture and leaving behind a trail of fear and uncertainty. As the years passed, the Cleveland torso murders investigation began to stall. Despite the initial fervor and numerous leads, the case had grown cold. The killer had managed to remain elusive, and the police faced increasing difficulties in making any significant progress. The murders had created an atmosphere of paranoia and dread in Cleveland, and many residents felt the authorities were losing control over the situation. In the late 1930s, the investigation saw a few new developments, but none that brought the case any closer to resolution. One of the notable events during this period was the appointment of a special investigator, a move intended to reinvigorate the stalled case. The investigator, an experienced detective with a reputation for solving difficult cases, was tasked with reviewing all evidence and interviewing any remaining witnesses. Despite his efforts, the new investigator faced the same challenges as his predecessors. The trail had gone cold, and most leads had either been exhausted or proved to be false. The media coverage had waned, and public interest in the case had diminished over time. The killer's methodical approach and ability to avoid capture had left the police with few new clues to follow. Amid the stagnation, the city of Cleveland continued to grapple with the psychological impact of the murders. The killer's reign of terror had left a lasting mark on the community, with many residents avoiding areas where bodies had been found and living in constant fear of becoming the next victim. The murders had also sparked debates about crime, safety, and the effectiveness of law enforcement. In the early 1940s, there were occasional reports of new leads or possible suspects, but these were typically based on rumors or unfounded theories. The case remained one of Cleveland's most notorious unsolved mysteries, and the killer's identity continued to elude both law enforcement and the public. One of the more intriguing developments during this period was the emergence of a potential link to a series of similar murders in other cities. Some theorists suggested that the Cleveland torso murders might be connected to a broader pattern of violence, possibly involving a traveling killer or a network of criminals. However, these theories were largely speculative and lacked concrete evidence. As the investigation faced increasing difficulties, law enforcement agencies began to shift their focus to other pressing cases. The Cleveland torso murders gradually faded from the forefront of public consciousness, though they remained a dark chapter in the city's history. The unsolved nature of the case continued to haunt those involved and left a lingering sense of unease among Cleveland's residents. Despite the passage of time, the mystery of the Cleveland torso murders remained unsolved. The killer's identity, motives, and ultimate fate continued to be the subject of speculation and debate, leaving behind a chilling legacy that endured for decades. As the years turned into decades, the Cleveland torso murders became a grim part of the city's history. The killer, whose identity and motives remained unknown, had left behind a legacy of fear and unresolved mystery that haunted Cleveland long after the murders ceased. The case had become a chilling example of the limits of early 20th century criminal investigations and a testament to the darkness that can lurk in the most unexpected places. Despite numerous efforts to solve the case, the investigation never reached a conclusion. Advances in forensic science and criminal profiling that emerged in later years offered new tools and methods, but they came too late for the Cleveland torso murders. The lack of crucial evidence and the killer's ability to evade capture meant that the case remained one of Cleveland's most notorious unsolved mysteries. The impact of the murders extended beyond the immediate terror they caused. The case had a profound effect on the community, contributing to a heightened sense of vulnerability and a more cautious approach to urban safety. The fear of a hidden killer, lurking in the city's shadows, became a part of the collective memory of Cleveland's residents. Over time, the Cleveland torso murders became a subject of fascination for true crime enthusiasts and historians. The case was revisited in various books, documentaries, and articles, each exploring different theories and possibilities. Some researchers suggested potential connections to other famous unsolved cases, while others examined the psychological profile of the killer, trying to understand the mind behind the murders. One of the most persistent theories was that the killer might have been someone with a deep-seated need for control or a specific psychological disorder. The meticulous nature of the dismemberments suggested a methodical and calculated approach, but the exact reasons behind the murders remained speculative. The killer's ability to remain undetected for so long only added to the mystique and horror of the case. In recent years, the Cleveland torso murders have been remembered not only for their gruesome details, but also for the broader issues they highlighted about crime and investigation during that era. The case stands as a reminder of the challenges faced by early law enforcement and the often overlooked stories of those affected by violent crime. As of today, the mystery of the Cleveland torso murders remains unsolved. The case continues to captivate and unsettle those who delve into its dark history, serving as a chilling reminder of the shadows that can linger long after the events have passed. The killer's identity, motives, and ultimate fate remain one of Cleveland's most enduring and haunting enigmas. The legacy of the Cleveland torso murders endures as a somber chapter in the city's history, a testament to both the horror of the crimes and the enduring quest for answers that continues to this day. Edward Wayne Edwards, born on June 14, 1933, in Akron, Ohio, lived a troubled and crime-filled life that eventually led him to become one of America's most infamous serial killers. His life was riddled with violence, deception, and crime, beginning in his early years and lasting well into his senior years. Edwards's criminal activities spanned decades, with crimes that included everything from robbery to cold-blooded murder. Raised in an orphanage after his mother committed suicide when he was just a child, Edwards's life was marked by instability. He endured abuse while growing up and spent much of his youth in and out of juvenile detention centers. His rough upbringing seemed to shape his worldview, and by his early adulthood, he was drifting across the country, committing crimes, and getting in trouble with the law. In 1955, Edwards escaped from a jail in Akron, Ohio, which marked the beginning of his career as a fugitive. His crimes escalated over the years, and he soon found himself on the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list. Though he was captured in 1962, this was far from the end of his criminal path. After being released on parole in 1967, Edwards led what seemed to be a reformed life for a while, even writing an autobiography and becoming a motivational speaker. However, behind the scenes, his violent tendencies were only beginning to surface. By 1977, Edwards had committed the first of at least 5 known murders. His victims ranged from young couples to his own foster son, all of whom met tragic and violent deaths. While Edwards may have outwardly portrayed himself as a reformed man, his dark impulses and greed led him down a path of ruthless killing that shocked investigators and the nation. The first murders connected to Edwards occurred in Ohio in 1977. His victims were William Billy Lavaco, 21, and his girlfriend Judith Straub, 18. The couple had been dating for 8 months when they were last seen together on August 7th, 1977. Their bodies were found the next day in a remote area of Silver Creek Metro Park in Norton, Ohio. Both had been shot at close range with a 20-gauge shotgun, a brutal act that stunned the local community. The investigation into their deaths would later reveal Edwards as the perpetrator, but at the time, their murders remained unsolved for decades. Edwards' violent tendencies didn't stop there. In 1980, he struck again, this time in Wisconsin. Tim Hack, 19, and Kelly Drew, 19, were a young couple from Jefferson, Wisconsin, who disappeared after attending a wedding reception. Their bodies were found weeks later in a wooded area. Hack had been stabbed to death, while Drew had been strangled, leaving the community reeling from the senseless brutality. These killings, known as the Sweetheart Murders, puzzled investigators for years. During the time between these murders, Edwards continued living a transient life, moving from state to state and working odd jobs. He often lived under various aliases, making it difficult for law enforcement to track his movements. But in 1996, Edwards committed another heinous crime, this time killing someone he knew personally. His foster son, Danny Boy Edwards, was the victim of Edwards' greed-driven murder. Edwards murdered Danny Boy to collect a $250,000 life insurance payout. He took the young man into the woods near their home in Burton, Ohio, and shot him twice in the face, leaving his body in a shallow grave. It was a cold and calculated killing that shocked even seasoned investigators. Despite these brutal crimes, Edwards managed to evade justice for years, continuing his life of deception and murder. While Edwards lived a life of apparent normalcy, working various jobs and raising a family, authorities were piecing together a puzzle that would eventually lead to his capture. His crimes went unsolved for years, largely due to his ability to maintain multiple identities and move frequently. His nomadic lifestyle made him hard to pin down, and without modern forensic tools like DNA testing, investigators struggled to connect the dots. The 1980 Sweetheart Murders of Tim Hack and Kelly Drew remained unsolved for nearly 3 decades. At the time, Edwards was questioned by the police, but there wasn't enough evidence to hold him. He slipped through the cracks and continued his life of crime. However, advances in forensic technology would eventually catch up with him. In 2009, authorities reopened the investigation into the Sweetheart Murders. DNA evidence collected at the crime scene was re-examined, and a match was made to Edwards, but it wasn't just science that led to his downfall. Edwards' own daughter, April Bellacchio, tipped off police about her father's possible involvement in the murders. Her suspicions, coupled with the DNA evidence, finally gave investigators the break they needed. By the time Edwards was arrested in 2009, he had been living a quiet life in Louisville, Kentucky. His neighbors described him as a friendly, unassuming man, unaware of the dark history that followed him. But as the investigation progressed, it became clear that Edwards had been living a double life, one that was filled with lies, violence, and murder. Once Edwards was in custody, the true extent of his crimes began to unfold. Investigators were stunned to learn the man who had appeared on television, shows like To Tell the Truth, and written an autobiography about his reformation, was in fact a cold-blooded killer. Edwards initially denied involvement in the Sweetheart murders, but eventually confessed to the killings of both Tim Hack and Kelly Drew. As the investigation continued, Edwards also confessed to the 1977 murders of Billy Lavaco and Judith Straub in Ohio. It was a shocking revelation for the families of the victims, who had waited decades for justice. Edwards's confessions were a relief in some ways, as they brought closure to unsolved cases, but they also painted a disturbing picture of a man who had evaded capture for far too long. Edwards wasn't done confessing. He also admitted to killing his foster son, Danny Boy Edwards, in 1996. Investigators uncovered the chilling details of the murder: how Edwards had manipulated Danny Boy into going AWOL from the army, only to take him into the woods and shoot him for insurance money. The callousness of the crime was hard to comprehend, especially coming from someone who was supposed to be a father figure. With these confessions, Edwards's body count rose to 5 confirmed murders. However, some investigators believe that there may be more victims. Edwards's transient lifestyle and long history of criminal activity leave the possibility that he was involved in other unsolved cases. His own daughter has stated that she believes there could be additional victims. In 2010, Edwards pleaded guilty to the murders of Tim Hack, Kelly Drew, Billy Lavaco, and Judith Straub. He was sentenced to life in prison for these crimes, finally bringing justice to the families of his victims. However, the case didn't end there. In 2011, Edwards was sentenced to death for the murder of his foster son, Danny Boy. It was a sentence that Edwards didn't seem to fear. In fact, he welcomed it, stating that he was ready to die. But Edwards wouldn't live long enough to face execution. On April 7, 2011, he died of natural causes while incarcerated in Columbus, Ohio. He was 77 years old and suffering from various health issues, including diabetes and heart disease. His death brought an end to a life of crime that had spanned decades and left a trail of devastation in its wake. Although Edwards is no longer alive to face the consequences of his actions, his story continues to haunt those who were affected by his crimes. His ability to evade capture for so many years, coupled with the brutal nature of his murders, makes him one of the most notorious killers in Ohio's history. While his confirmed body count stands at 5, the true number of his victims may never be known. Edward's story serves as a chilling reminder of how someone can live a double life, hiding their dark secrets while projecting an image of normalcy to the world. For the families of his victims, his death may have brought some closure, but the scars left by his actions will last forever